Hi guys, it's Nikki. I'm here for part 2 of my review for World War Z by Max Brooks. This is the spoiler-filled review, so if you have not read the book and do not want to be spoiled, please click off the video. You can go watch my spoiler-free video. I will be listing it in the description below. And if you're otherwise interested or have read the book before and are just interested to hear the review, please listen on. So I'll kind of touch on what I touched on in the last video. It's an oral history of the zombie war. It's a really nice change from your typical zombie apocalypse books in that it's not from an individual perspective, but from multiple perspectives. And the interview style was just very effective because it allowed for these individual stories of a shared experience to flesh out the overarching story of humanity from the time of patient zero to the recovery period touched on at the end. And the reason I found it so effective is because the multiple perspectives also allowed for people from different walks of life to be interviewed. So you had doctors, with patient zero, you had smugglers, you had politicians from all different countries, and how they were dealing with the different options for action that they had. And you talked to the scientists as well, the people that were coming up with these, and the soldiers and military, the people that were coming up with these plans of action for the politicians to enact to try to preserve the countries and the governments. And you also had stories from just your typical civilians and how they were dealing with the different issues and how they were dealing with the situations and the emotion and the actions that they could take on their own front. Like I said, I found it really effective. It drove the story forward at such a good pace, constantly giving you information, but the different perspectives also keeping the story fresh and engaging. A couple of my favorite perspectives. One was the girl who, in the interview, was basically just telling the story of how she got to where she was. She's considered one of these feral children where no one really knows what happens to their parents. They assume that the parents are dead, and these children are usually picked up by the military or other civilians. You talk to her here just kind of in a mental health institution of some kind. At the beginning of her interview, she's described as having the mental age of about 4, which is how old she was when this event occurred, and this trauma is part of what has kept her from developing appropriately and kept her at this young mental age. And honestly, this was probably the creepiest and saddest story that you heard. You kind of hear her tell a very typical story of the time, people congregating in a church thinking that it'll save them or that someone will save them, but it's just the idea that these people are congregating there, and just even when she was a child and she didn't quite understand, she could see the hopelessness in all of the parents. And just talking about her mother's actions, the mother of one of her friends' actions, the actions of other parents, and some of the religious leader for the local area. What keeps it from being almost traumatizing to the reader is that because it's from this child's perspective, there is a twist of innocence that results in confusion rather than also despair on their part. I made the mistake of reading this part of the book right before I went to bed, and it was just, I had the heebie-jeebies all night and had such a hard time falling asleep. But it was easily my favorite interview in the entire book. And you also have a couple other interviews. So you talk to the mercenary who's working for, I believe it was kind of a small-time celebrity or producer of some kind, who's setting up basically like this Big Brother style house for people. And the part I liked about this was he was talking about seeing people run up to fences, and it's just like, oh no, because they had so far been dealing with these zombies who were slow and couldn't climb and couldn't walk or couldn't run, couldn't jump. Every time he saw something that couldn't immediately be identified as a person, just this fear of, oh, what if they can run, maybe they can jump, and if they can jump, they can probably climb. And that just, the idea of that being so overwhelming, just being such a morale eater, was really interesting to read. And it really helped cement this idea of both fear and not fear of the zombies. Because the fear was because you didn't want to be turned, but the not fear was because you could effectively deal with them despite the overwhelming number of them. Another one that I really enjoyed, you talked to the Israeli. Basically, he says he could be a spy. He works for a bunch of intelligence agencies and has since before the fall of civilization as we knew it. And this one is very interesting because it's the first one to touch on the containment protocols and how there were so many civilians that were upset with the containment protocols because the containment protocols weren't save everyone. It was save the uninfected and save the important uninfected. Every time this comes up following this interview, it really makes sense, and you understand both why the military and scientists were coming up with it, why the politicians were both enacting it or afraid to enact it, and why the civilians were so upset with everything that they were doing. Because at times like this, emotions running high, and you're not going to be thinking, this is the logical thing you're to do. You're going to think, I want to survive, I want to be saved. Why aren't you doing those things for me? And then finally, I'm going to touch, the last of my favorites was the soldier who was dealing with one of, I believe they called it like the reclamation battles. People had finally stabilized under a new government, and one of the first things they wanted to do was give people hope by reclaiming old land. And this soldier talks about the differences with this reclamation war, how it was different than fighting people from before the fall. And the big thing with them that he talked about was difference in fighting people versus fighting zombies. Because in many wars before this, the military specifically would depend on different types of attrition to help wear down their enemy. But in here, that doesn't work because you don't have to worry about food and morale, psychological effects of the battle on the zombies, because all they care about is, I can smell this person, I'm going to eat this person, or I'm going to eat parts of this person, and then they will become infected. And so that ended up being harder on soldiers than people, I think, had initially thought, and it resulted in a lot of psychologists and psychology teams and psychiatry teams being included on these reclamation battles. And the other thing the soldier talked about was the difference just overall in terms of fighting. They'd gone to the point where they had all of these amazing nerve agents and all of these amazing but really destructive weapons. And the issue with this is that they were made to work on humans. So because there was already something wrong with the central nervous system, any kind of neurotoxin or neurological based weapons didn't work. Anything that wasn't a direct hit that destroyed the brain and brainstem immediately would just result in a zombie with extra things on it that would still come at the people. And he talked about how frightening and how worried they were that you'd have a zombie on fire still dragging itself to you, or you'd end up dropping bombs on it, and it's just like what kind of radiation and other effects from those would be on the zombies when it came to you. Again, it resulted again in this issue with mental health. It resulted in all of this extra psychological, all these extra psychological teams to be included as people went out for reclamation wars and other wars, just because they were needed that much more for morale. And I found it very interesting to see it from the soldiers' perspective, just watching their fellow soldiers break and just their description of how overwhelming it was and how worrying it was going back and fighting these reclamation wars, even though it was to give people hope, that so many of the soldiers going out did not also share this hope because of the situation they were going into. It was just really interesting, and I loved it. I did have one section I wasn't crazy about. My least favorite, and that's not to say that I didn't enjoy it, I just wasn't crazy about it. My least favorite interview was probably with the former pilot who'd had a mayday and ended up needing to survive for so much time or get out of the area in order to be saved because she was in a hot zone. And the idea that she just talked to someone, I'm not sure what it was. The pacing here wasn't as enjoyable for me. And there was just something about the story, I can't put my finger on it, but there's just something about the story she was telling that I wasn't crazy about. It fleshed out a lot of what it was like to go into the hot zones, what it was like to try to find people, save, and scouting missions for some of this reclamation stuff. And I just wasn't crazy about it, even though it was important and did some good and important narratives for moving forward on other military fronts. I just wasn't crazy about it, and it didn't distract from my enjoyment of the book in the least. It just wasn't my favorite. I also want to talk a bit about the zombies themselves, or the zombies. They were really interesting, just this idea that this infection of sorts was, in effect, resulting in a reanimation of the dead, but only allowing for basic functions, so they weren't necessarily able to adjust their breathing, which is why they could only walk. Their blood and other fluids were so much thicker and more viscous, and it just ended up presenting with things that it presented with things current weapons couldn't deal with. And like I said, they're just really interesting. There was that idea like slow, there's no running, no jumping, no climbing, no higher functions or thinking of any kind. They're just what you'd expect zombies to be. But instead of being this weird kind of horror creature, it's just this scientifically based monster. Zombies are a feasible and believable enemy, and the cause of them was also believable by just extrapolating our knowledge and current viral and parasitic and bacterial infections. I also wanted to touch a little bit on mental health. I talked about it a bit with the soldier, just with the trying to get hope and the psychological and psychiatric teams that were included with a lot of the military strategies, because it was really important. And even at one point, there's a man who was a former film producer who ended up producing a bunch of, for lack of a better term, like propaganda films. They were showing them to help prevent suicides and the specific disorder that they named after the situation, where people were it was basically SIDS, but stress induced because of the crisis. And it's just very interesting how they dealt with it, how the fact that they knew they had to. I also talked about it a bit with the young girl who was describing her experience in a church, because you would get these feral children and eventually feral adults, because depending on how old they were when they had problems, you would get children who were feral in the sense that they were living off the wild, or you get feral children in the sense that they had stopped their development, and it resulted in these people growing up to have these adult bodies, but not the cognitive faculties or facilities that you would expect them to have. And so the feral children were talked about a lot with people who were cleaning out or scouting. They would want to reclaim the people and take them to get them the help they need. And a lot of psychological and psychiatric teams really encouraged soldiers and civilians to do these things when they were out on patrol or out fighting reclamation wars. The other interesting thing was I think you pronounce it quislings. These are the people who basically ended up having some kind of trauma that was so destructive that these people lost touch with reality and ended up imitating or thinking that they were zombies. They would make the moans, they would walk like them, they would react like them. They even would have the lack of pain that is associated with zombies. It's just very interesting to read just a few accounts of them and how psychiatric and psychological facilities were still attempting to rehabilitate them. But the fact that it resulted in a lot of humans being killed because people weren't sure that they weren't zombies, so they would go for the head and, for lack of a better term, put them out of their misery. And also so the shooter would be able to save themselves. It's very interesting that they included this and that you got to see this part of it. I really enjoyed how, again, it just really emphasized kind of the hopelessness and the seriousness of the situation, because it is a zombie apocalypse, and it'd be not weird. The story would have been less good to me if they hadn't been as thorough in covering all of these things. And I really enjoyed it. The Quislings were just creepy, and everybody who talks about them says that, but I also admired all of the effort put into these psychological or psychiatric, all the efforts put in to help maintain the mental health of the people who are left. And I just take it as good foresight by these educated professionals who wanted to be able to allow for people to continue on as best they could with their daily lives moving forward. All right, that kind of sums up my spoiler-filled review of this book. It was a really great zombie apocalypse book. The storytelling was very effective, and by talking to so many different people, you got a very thorough description of the situation, and the narrator allowed for just this really effective storytelling and use of shared experience to cover this pandemic. I loved that it went from patient zero to recovery efforts, so it didn't just leave you hanging after hope was established. It took you all the way through and kind of explained to you how civilization, as it changed, was moving forward and what they were doing to continue to move forward. Like I said, I really liked this book. I give World War Z a 5 out of 5 stars. It's a terrific read. I recommend it to anybody who loves this genre. And if you're not crazy about the genre, I would suggest maybe giving it a try. Just the way it was written was very effective, and it was very interesting, and it allowed for the fact that this was a zombie apocalypse almost to be put on this back seat by tying you to specifically the humanity of the situation, the humanity of the population as it was dealing with this. And if you have read this book and enjoyed it and haven't read Max Brooks' other book, The Zombie Survival Guide, I recommend this book as well. It's almost like a supplementary text to World War Z. It goes a little more in depth into different things, and it talks a bit more specifically about what this kind of infection was and how they were either dealing with it or not dealing with it based on what was available to them. It's really interesting. It's written almost as this guy's personal files, getting ready for a zombie apocalypse. And the manner and tone are very similar to World War Z. And like I said, if you enjoyed World War Z, or think you will enjoy World War Z, I would recommend reading it along with this. That is it. I will see you guys next week for the paired review with this book review. I will be reviewing the movie World War Z, and although I've seen the movie before, it'll be interesting to rewatch it and compare it to the book a little more closely. I will see you guys then. Bye! Hi guys, I'm here just to give you guys a quick announcement for my Book of the Month Club for February. It is The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. Looks like it'll be an interesting kind of sci-fi, post-apocalyptic book. And you know what? I've started reading it. I'm enjoying it so far. I hope that anybody who chooses to read it with me will also enjoy it. And I will see you guys at the end of the month for this Book of the Month review. Bye!